this is, sort of Ukraine's worst fears, or some of their worst fears about their relationship with the United States coming true. I think there is a fear that the U.S. isn't necessarily prioritizing their defense needs, particularly during the second Trump administration. We've seen Trump sort of, I don't want to say take a full step back, but, he's been a bit more maybe cautious, or not as enthusiastic in his support of Ukraine as President Biden was during that last administration. So it's something that I think the Ukrainians are obviously trying to get used to.
Let's hop stateside and say hi to Julia Manchester, back with us, national political reporter at The Hill. Hello to you, Julia.
Hey, John, thanks for having me.
Always welcome. Julia, so look, what should we talk about first? What about the news we've been discussing on air today? The announcement from the administration, the Trump administration, out of the Department of Defense, that arms supplies to Ukraine had been halted, had been paused, including missiles vital to air defence. Now, when I say it came out of the blue, it seems to be so, because I spoke a little bit earlier on to the chair of the Ukrainian Parliament's Foreign Relations Committee, that's Alexander Mereshko, and he said this.
We have official statement by our Ministry of Defense, which says that we need official confirmation of our American counterparts, and our Ministry of Defense is trying to get in touch with the Pentagon to confirm and to settle this issue. At the same time, today, the representative of the United States American Embassy, Chargé d'Affaires, was invited to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Ukraine.
It sounds, though, Alexander, from what you're saying there, that the government of Ukraine had no warning that the supply of weapons was going to be stopped or paused in this way.
Well, officially, there was no warning, of course, and there was no confirmation about that. It's, of course, disturbing for us.
So the announcement was made, signed off by Pete Hegseth, the Secretary for Defense in the administration, and it came out of the blue to the Ukrainian government. How's this going down there, Julia? It is a story. I've seen it being played on some of the networks.
Look, it's a little interesting. I guess it's an interesting development, because last week at the NATO summit, President Trump was talking about these Patriot missiles and trying to find them for Ukraine. So this seems like a bit of an about face, but the White House is essentially saying this is just sort of about the current American stockpile and what Americans are able to provide. But, I think at the end of the day, this is, sort of Ukraine's worst fears, or some of their worst fears about their relationship with the United States coming true. I think there is a fear that the U.S. isn't necessarily prioritizing their defense needs, particularly during the second Trump administration. We've seen Trump sort of, I don't want to say take a full step back, but, he's been a bit more maybe cautious, or not as enthusiastic in his support of Ukraine as President Biden was during that last administration. So it's something that I think the Ukrainians are obviously trying to get used to. I think it was during the G7 earlier this month, not that this is directly related, but President Trump rushed back from that summit, sort of leaving Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky high and dry there when Zelensky was trying to get time with Trump. And we all know that there obviously is this big divide in the Republican Party over isolationism, or this America First agenda. There are a lot of defense hawks within the Republican Party. I would say Secretary of State Marco Rubio is one of them, who want to push back against Russian influence by any means necessary. But there's others within the party who say we need to literally put America first and take care of our issues here at home, and not be this, as big of a global presence, if you will. So certainly, if you're Ukrainian, very concerning right now.
What do you think about this, Mikey and Henry? After the NATO summit, there was yet again another flurry of talk that maybe Trump was warming to the idea of getting tough with Putin. I mean, that he had, again, to use that, become a cliche, losing patience with Vladimir Putin. And then he was talking about maybe sending Patriot missiles to Ukraine. And I spoke to a number of people, including General Philip Breedlove, a former Supreme Commander in Europe of NATO, and he was arguing, look, it looks as if Putin's overplayed his hand. He's been tagging the president along for far too long, and Trump's had enough of it. And then a sudden announcement out of the blue, they're going to pause the supply of weapons. As I say, out of the blue. it is certainly for Ukraine bitterly disappointing, and on the face of it, another about face.
It is. Although the announcement has come out of the blue, this has been a clock that's been ticking under American and Western policy for some time, which is simply the fact that because we tend to have especially America, has very expensively developed weapon systems, and they have a very long tail and a very expensive tail when it comes to getting them and producing them and manufacturing them. Therefore, America has finite stocks of these weapons. And there has always been a concern, and we've seen this actually several times, even under the Biden administration, there was a huge back and forth about whether or not to send ATACMS, and do not ask me what that abbreviation stands for, but they were meant to be a game-changing weapon. And the problem is that America only has so much ammunition for any of these weapons, and there was a debate within the American defense establishment about what minimum level, given that America, much more than us, has global defense commitments, what minimum level do we need to keep in American arsenals? And so the sheer suddenness of this is perhaps a surprise.
Yeah, but that was also, when it came to those longer-range missiles, the ATACMS, that was also about an American concern, Biden's concern, about those weapons being used to strike into Russian territory, which was a kind of escalation which he definitely didn't want to see. And we've seen, the complexion of American reservations has changed significantly since then.
They have, but ultimately the challenge with the war going on this long is it's become an attritional conflict. And Russia spends 7% of GDP on defence. That money goes an awful lot further because it is much cheaper in Russia, and they have much lower standards for things like workplace welfare and everything else. And they're developing lots of very cheap weapons. Glide bombs are literally just old 1980s munitions that they've stuck some wings on. They're buying drones that have been manufactured by Iran. And when we send in very expensive Western systems, they can often knock stuff out, but you're not trading at a good enough rate to turn the tide of the war. And the problem from the Western perspective is you can throw potentially your entire arsenal of advanced weaponry into this war, but without the ability to deliver change on the ground, and this is where the failure of the Ukrainian offensive in 23, I think, comes into it, without the ability to change the facts on the ground, the question is they're not going to necessarily achieve anything because Russia simply has too much cheap equipment to be knocked out by this stuff.
Yeah, Russia now, in very recent weeks, they've upped the volume of air attacks and drones and missiles that have been fired into Ukraine. Just the last few weeks has seen the equivalent of many months previously that by way of a Russian air attack. So this is distressing to Ukraine, Mikey.
Well, I think there's another aspect to this, which is, from what I gather, a lot of the push towards halting these shipments has come from the Department of Defence rather than from the White House. They've been sort of reassessing their stockpile, as you say, and found it lacking and are starting to get a little bit concerned about it.
Would the Pentagon be doing this without the White House being in the loop completely?
Which is the second point, which is that these munitions were promised to Ukraine by Joe Biden. This is how far back this goes. And Trump has been systematically unpicking everything Biden did over the last 6 months. And I think if someone at the Pentagon went to him and said, hey, Biden promised all of these things, you don't really want to do that, do you? I don't think he would have had much to think about there. I think he would have said no, fine, and maybe down the line we talk about sending different munitions that have come from me and not from Biden.
The president just seems to be so disinclined to turning the screw on Russia anyway. I mean, talking endlessly about upping sanctions and not doing it, always saying, I'll make my mind up in 2 weeks' time. Yeah,
I mean, he says 2 weeks' time about everything. And I spend a lot of time listening to Donald Trump talking on television in the Oval Office. And one thing that's come up over the last couple of weeks is that he's very, very happy that Vladimir Putin has been saying so many nice things about him. Because he has. All
right, so that's Mikey Smith. Henry Hill's here from Conservative Home, and we have from The Hill in Washington, Julia, Manchester.